No. Okay. Right.
Hey everyone, thank you guys for tuning in. I'm super excited to be here. If you don't know who I am, my name is Michaela, and I am a entrepreneur and a mother of two very wild animals that are boys. And I'm just a very curious person. So I feel very lucky to be able to have these conversations and to lead this conversation with Dr. Rusty today. He is a neurologist, and he's here to talk about brain development, childhood, environmental toxins, and how they all kind of play a factor with one another. And I'm here to listen, and I would be taking notes, but I'm going to go back and watch this recording and take notes after. I always feel like I need to be taking notes in conversations like this. So, Dr. Rusty, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michaela. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Okay, tell us a little bit about your journey as a neurologist. How did you come to, first of all, how did you come to treating children?
Well, that's kind of a whole nother part of the journey. The story actually wasn't heading towards medicine. I majored in music as a piano performance major and languages, mostly out of, with all respect to my most incredible parents, more out of rebellion. My dad was a pediatrician, and I wasn't going to do what dad, whatever, stubborn stuff we do as kids and then sometimes as adults. But I worked throughout high school, junior high I worked with the deaf population, and I worked at nursing homes, and I loved doing that. And I did activities, music and things. And so when I finally decided my third year in college that I don't want to hang around with musicians, and I knew I wouldn't be a world famous linguist and all. So I switched, and I said, I'm going to go ahead and go into medicine. And all the musicians are pretty cool people. So switched, and then got into med school and said, I'm going to go into geriatrics, kind of the other end of the spectrum, because I love that. And then when I, through medical school, different rotations, and I'd worked in the Special Olympics through high school, working, and I was home when I rotated through pediatrics and developmental medicine and neurology. It's where I felt at home. And that started a career of 40 years of doing that stuff and training. And but even back then, I think always looking for more than the standard fare, the status quo. And we have an incredible medical world here, allopathic, which is, again, all this can be used against me in a international court of peers. But it's like allopathic is our healthcare system has evolved so much into primarily allopathy, which is look for a symptom and we treat it with I call it D&D, drugs and dissection, not Dungeons and Dragons. We treat things with pharmaceuticals, which have their place, and there won't be any non-disclosed partnerships like that. And then dissection is surgery. And if we can't fix it with some type of a chemical, then we cut it out. And there are times that those are very, very, and this is a long answer, but you know me, I give long answers. So
I'm here for it.
But it's how I got in, how it evolved 40 years later at the age of 65 to be having these conversations and trying to engage the worldwide community that, as you know, we are missing one of the biggest elephants, invisible elephants in the room, and literally. So
I feel like it takes a lot of bravery in that field to take a different approach, because I see, especially with, just kind of the way everything unfolded in the last few years, you could kind of see that there were people who were, who did kind of want to go on, and then they got brought back. So I feel like it's a really brave move on your part to kind of take a different approach than just the let's treat the symptoms, and really start looking at what's causing these symptoms, and let's look at that. So do you have a specific moment that really kind of led you to start thinking about that, or was that always kind of how you approached it?
a little bit of both. I've had many what I call matrix, waking up from the matrix moments. If you ever saw the first Matrix movie, which is I think one of the most
Best movies
movies
ever.
ever movies ever made. And so a little of both. And as I went through training, and then I wanted to keep doing other things. So while I was in med school, I worked on my master's in piano performance because I wanted something else to do to distract. And still my patient, amazing wife, 44 years, was there all the way along the way. And but I wanted to taste everything. I thought I would do geriatrics because I wasn't going to be a pediatrician. And I love that. As I said, when I got on, worked with these incredible clinicians in neurology and developmental pediatrics, one crucial career-changing moment was two incredible, Jack Trembath and John Mueller. Gosh, I can't remember his name, but they were developmental pediatricians working with kids with complex issues. And they said, if you love this, we love it too. Don't do what we did. Don't do developmental pediatrics, go into neurology, which was kind of a whole different track and a little bit more training and all that. So I said, okay, and rotated on neurology and worked with one of the best pediatric neurologists in third or early in my fourth year in med school, Dr. Torkelson, who was just inspired me. And so I took all the other stuff because I wanted to be a well-grounded, well-rounded physician and understand all the organ systems, because although we're not overtly taught it in medical school like we should be, maybe a little bit more these days, but not much, we're all connected. So when we look at symptoms, pervasive symptoms of electromagnetic sensitivity or people's reactions when we're radiated, it doesn't just affect one organ system. Every organ system, literally head to toe, is affected. And so anyway, did that journey. And so that was one matrix moment, and did the residency. And then I did a couple fellowships in neurophysiology and epilepsy and electromagnetic EMG, all dealing with electricity, because that's we are electromagnetic beings, right? That's how we're created. And so we do all these tests that test us electromagnetically, electroencephalography, magnetoencephalography, magnetic resonance imaging, because we're electromagnetic. And yet, and I don't remember a big white light type of experience with that, but because I've always believed that science supports we are fundamentally electromagnetic, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that although medicines can help acutely, they don't often help in many situations long-term. How many people on long-term medications, the dose needs to increase, it needs to switch, because our bodies are smarter than we are. And I think when, I know they're smarter and our brains are smarter than we are. And when we introduce an appropriately chosen pharmaceutical for some indication, our bodies and what we deal with are smarter. And so we have to increase dose. And I feel like, particularly with kids with seizures, sometimes we'll bring in a seizure medicine, anti-seizure medicine, and seizures kind of, oh, okay, I got this. I'm going to be quiet. And then the brain goes, bring it on, because I'm ready for this. And we need, because it will accommodate, not like in addiction per se, but it gets smart. It knows its workarounds. I mean, we've seen that in the simple analogy of penicillin when it was first discovered, and how many thousands of units, and now how many millions organisms, living organisms that are also electromagnetic, which is why we're seeing problems throughout the mammalian world, the bee population, all these kinds of things, but they respond and get smarter. So now we have millions and millions of units to treat something. So antibiotics are important, and I am not anti-pharmaceutical. I don't have any partnerships. They can help. You you heard me maybe say this, there's a lot of depression symptoms and anxiety symptoms in the world, and it's increasing. And I think we know, at least in part, if not significantly, why that's happening. And so an antidepressant can, I'll throw in just a couple of these things that are popping to mind that you've heard me harp on, but an antidepressant may be a life-saving intervention for somebody. to get them broken so you can do the other stuff that we need to do to help somebody with depression. It's not just when we use a pharmaceutical and we're too busy to do the rest of the stuff. It's kind of like giving somebody acetaminophen, ibuprofen for their meningitis. You might bring the fever down a little bit, but you're not helping the root causes, right? And as we know too, looking at the crisis in the mental ill health industry and world, is these doses increased and then we switch, yada, yada, yada. And another little thing that I try to shake but can't get away from, the SSRIs, and we won't be discussing in name brands or anything like that, but they deal with the serotonin.
Right.
And so when I'm working with students and residents and our families, kids, where's serotonin made? And of course, if you're talking to a neurologist, the right answer is supposed to be in the brain, right? I said, that's good. How much is made in the brain? We may have talked about this before. Of all the serotonin that the body produces, how much is produced out of the brain? And this is debatable, 5 to 10% of the brain. Where's the rest of it come from?
Wow.
The gut. 90% is gut derived. And so it shouldn't surprise us that when people have side effects from medicines, a lot of it's gut and genital urinary side effects from certain pharmaceuticals. But also, and you can actually help. I mean, people know when something's helping. They know the shade coming up when an antidepressant can help. But then the brain, usually you got to go up in the dose or eventually switch the dose. But we're trying to treat the brain, serotonin, and ignore the 90% other issues, and not just nutritional and dietary things that address that, but what anxiety does to our brain-gut connection, what not only our diet, but then getting more pertinent to this discussion, all of our electromagnetic use is pretty much on the midline. Our head, our AirPods, our earplugs, our devices, our iPads, or that's, I guess, proprietary, our tablets of whatever kind. And we use devices. What do they call? I don't have, it's right over here. Those little things we put, laptop computers. And I've showed you those pictures and we can go over those if we need to. They emit. So we're affecting our electromagnetic system and billions of neurons in the nervous system, the cardiac neuronal system, the neurology of the cardiac system, the neurology of the gut, all that's affected. And so if we don't look at that and we simply prescribe a medication to treat a symptom, as you mentioned earlier, it's like, it might help. And you might help the fever with somebody with meningitis, and maybe the meningitis will go away on its own. But I don't think that's going to happen. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's like you gotta, sometimes someone is drowning and you have to reel them back in. But then once you reel them back in, you take the hook out. Like it's like now we, the hook in. It's like we got the back. Now let's, implement all these other things to. I love what you said about that, because I agree that sometimes the modern medicine world is very important. Like they saved my son's life after he was born. He needed an intestinal surgery. He had jejunal atresia. He needed, his intestines were completely unattached. And it was an interesting lesson for me because I was so anti-hospital at that point. And, it really allowed me to gain appreciation for those medical interventions that allow us to save people, and it also made me start to think, was the environment that we were living in during that period of time and what would have caused this? Because, I did all of the things, I ate all organic and, all of the stuff. When you're pregnant, you're so aware of everything you eat and all of that. So I had a real mental crisis after that of like, what happened here? And the doctors were telling me, it just happened sometimes. Yeah. And I think sometimes things just happen, but it did start this is really when I started getting into EMF, because he was like, it happens within the first couple of weeks of gestation. And when I was pregnant with my first son, I was living in this 200 square foot loft apartment, and I was sleeping next to my Wi-Fi router and never really even thought about it. You know, I wasn't like fully aware of that at the time. And so for me, that was the only thing. And I'm not declaring that's what it was. There's no proof that's what it was, but it definitely is what started making me more aware of like environmental things. Cause I was always really aware of what I was putting in my body, which is, you know, one of the steps, but it was then the next step, like what's around me that I need to also be aware of.
And once you open the proverbial Pandora's box, it's huge.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you that question at some point too, that we haven't talked about before, is parental guilt. I mean, we have been through things with kids and with grandkids, and you know, kids that are alive, kids that we've lost, you know, and it's and the stuff we put ourselves through, and we're doing the best. You were doing the best you can. And you mentioned it just happens. That's what we say a lot. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever heard that word in medicine, idiopathic.
No.
It comes from the Greek and Latin roots, but idiopathic means, the way we use it in healthcare is it's have idiopathic seizures. Your son
There's so
had
much of that.
idiopathic jejunal atresia or whatever. And it in the root, it's I always say it means the doctor's an idiot and pathetic, but that doesn't go over very well. And it's our fancy way of saying, I don't know. You know, what caused it, mom? I don't know, but I don't know doesn't sound very scientific. And so, yes, it's idiopathic, and these things just happen. Nothing just happens in the universe. There's always a reason, just we can't often figure it out.
Yeah.
But you, in your journey to waking up, at least from this aspect of the matrix and mine, the deeper you go, the evidence is huge. I just presented in Dallas last week. We did a neurotoxicology workshop, and every time I do it, I revise my slide, keep looking, and the literature, and I'm not using like Google searches and things like that tend to sway to your preferences like media does. I don't know what that's called in media, but it will definitely keep putting up postings that strengthen your view, whatever that is, that is helping us to be objective and realize people think differently throughout the world. And anyway, the amount of stuff and the prenatal, both male and female prenatal reproductive studies and what goes on is huge. And how do you deliver that? And I still struggle with that with a family without going through, oh my gosh, what have I done? I caused this. No, you were doing the best you can. And then one other key point is the susceptibility, because you hear it, I guess, in the press and others. Well, if it's a big deal, why aren't we hearing about it more? Or if it's such a big deal, why isn't everybody having problems? Well, and my simplistic answer, not simple, it's just simplistic, which doesn't mean it's right. There's a lot of people in the world that smoke. We've known for many, many decades all the health adverse problems that come from that. But not everybody, and you may have known people who smoked their whole lives, and in their 80s and 90s, they're fine. And there's not this linear correlation.
Yeah.
And our universe is not linear, and electromagnetic is not always linear, but it's definitely cumulative in its effects with artificial. The term I use, and I don't know, we'll see at some of these international meetings what better terms I get, but artificial environmental electromagnetic radiation, or radio frequency radiation, EMR or RFR, and you've seen those abbreviations. And EMF is kind of the whole thing, electromagnetic frequency, which is what we learn about in school. So I'm kind of going on my usual squirrels, but that's okay.
Okay, so you say that again. So you said EMF is like, this is a good conversation, because this is actually one thing I have really struggled to explain, is actually like, what is EMF and what is the difference between like EMF and EMR? Like you see when you're reading studies, like when I'm reading studies, you see it called so many different things. And I don't know, like I actually don't know if there is a difference or if they just all call it different things.
Yeah. let me do this and see. I can, well, I don't want to get too distracted on terms, but sometimes images show it better. And I was just trying to find one of the quick slides, but I won't mess with that now. In my way of trying to understand electromagnetic frequency, that's the electromagnetic spectrum. If you look that up, we learned that in school. That kind of covers everything from extremely, extremely low frequency, the universal frequencies and things that go on, to very, very, very fast frequency, which is defined in hertz.
Okay, yeah.
The work that, of course, Dr. Hertz did, of cycles per second. And the more cycles per second, like 5G, 5 billion cycles, all that sorts of stuff, has a very short wavelength. The wavelengths are a big issue. The frequency, they're interrelated, inversely related. But what's important in understanding that, and I'll probably get off on that tangent and then come back to the overview. So that's the electromagnetic spectrum. But what causes the problems and also gives us life is the energy that comes from those frequencies. And the faster the frequency, the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy.
So that's why they need 5G towers every couple houses, because they're faster frequencies, but they're shorter wavelengths.
Right. That's a great way of looking at it. And I have to wrap my head around it, and I can't. I love physics and all that fun stuff, but I read physics for dummies, not the major text and things. But you're right. And now as we go up the scale, I don't know if I'll be able to share screen. Oh, yes, I can. Do you want me to share screen for a second?
Sure.
Because of course,
while you do that, I'm gonna turn my light on because my light turned off over here.
Uh-oh, okay.
There we go. Oh, wow.
Oh, one thing too, as you continue to have your conversations, and this is more of a secondary thing, but one of the things I was doing in this presentation, when we talked about biomarkers and things, how we're looking, a toxin is, in the technical sense, when you look at trials and scientific studies, a toxin is a naturally occurring substance. Botulinum toxin, which is used therapeutically when people want to use Botox, right? A toxin is natural. A toxicant is more of a human-derived toxin. So it's called a toxicant. That's just playing with words. But I took this route when I work with audiences and to have conversations that these affects us. We know toxins affect us all kinds of symptoms because they affect, if somebody gets arsenic poisoning, it might affect certain organs more specifically, but it affects our whole body. If you get radiation poisoning, it doesn't just affect one area, it affects others areas selectively. But when we look at this electromagnetic spectrum, I was trying to find the best picture for it. So this is kind of on the side. Usually, this is from the NASA website, but you usually see electromagnetic spectrum from essentially 0 hertz, which is direct current, all the way to really, really fast, this gamma. That's why when we see this symbol of gamma, we go, "Ooh, I don't like that. That doesn't look like a good thing. I think I want to get away from that." But it's gradual. And so to me, this is the electromagnetic spectrum consisting of all these electromagnetic frequencies. And within that, we'll talk about ionizing, non-ionizing quickly, because that's, I have at least what I've learned about it, because that's used a lot in some conversations to say, this is not real. It's not a deal because it's not thermal, right?
I see that a lot.
Or it's just thermal in its effects. And unfortunately, that ignores the basic laws of science, physics in particular, electromagnetics as well. But as we go down, this is a logarithmic scale. This isn't a linear scale, meaning each time when we switch, say, from 5G, 2G to 3G or whatever, when you make a leap, it logarithmically tenfold increases. So when we look at the wavelength or the frequencies, and what this chart is from the NASA standpoint is the energy. And so we're not, oh, I don't have it here. I usually have it, oh, here. So when we look at energy, again, the shorter the wavelength, if you start seeing this kind of stuff and this incredibly fast frequency like gamma, all who want to be in front of gamma, raise your hand. Right. We don't want to. And that's because the energy is so powerful. And so the further we go down this scale, the more energy is behind it.
So 5G is actually really far on that scale. When I was reading, so when I started reading studies, like one of the studies that I was, reading, it had exposed rats to 900 hertz. And so I didn't really understand what that was, but it was showing, tumors in these rats with 900 hertz. And then I was like researching, like, I wonder what, 5G is. And it's like over 30 gigahertz. And then it's like, what's a gigahertz? It's like, it's 1,000 hertz or whatever. It's like, what?
A million, billion, a billion. I mean, it just.
Oh, billion hertz. And so, that's 1,000 megahertz.
Yeah. That's like, gives you a mega headache,
It does. Like, yeah. When you really start understanding how much of an increase that we're looking at. And it's not just like in some places, like they want to put it in your neighborhood. They want to put it every couple houses. Like it's a big deal.
And it's one of my, well, first, I just want to have conversation. I'm not out debating. I'm not out politically advocating.
Don't act Dr. Rusty, guys, if you're listening to this.
Yeah, we all have pasts, and I can talk about my past another time, but hopefully I will continue a path of lifelong learning. But two things just about this is a wonderful chart to frame things, because we all learned this and learned about it back in middle school, high school, and all that sorts of stuff. But how does that apply? We are in an electromagnetic universe, and we are electromagnetic beings living in this, what I think is increasingly toxic electromagnetic environment. So as we keep increasing, for example, going from 5G to 6G, which is not yet on here, is not just a factor of 20% or something, going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 or something. Right. No, it's just small increment. It's logarithmic. So what I was going to show here, when you think of things like what does 5G do, how far it penetrates when we're in a 5G environment, it penetrates. That's it. We don't have radioactive shields. We don't live in a Faraday cage. Our skin is not a Faraday cage around us. So it can penetrate all through our bodies and into our nervous system, 5 to 6 centimeters. But here's another way of looking at this electromagnetic spectrum, right? So we see the frequencies here all the way up, and we have gamma. And obviously it just doesn't stop. It's there. So much of it, because of the amazing world that we live in, we're protected from. But this has nothing to do with the ozone layer, which obviously, but there's this area of transparency, if it's showing up okay on the slide, that exists naturally in our natural electromagnetic environment. And it's in this megahertz to approaching eventually terahertz range, which is why satellites emitting can have so much effect. They're not going to be filtered out so much by the ionosphere and the stratosphere, these things that are shielding. They are there to protect us.
Okay.
Otherwise,
so what this space is basically like so the gray is like protection that we have against certain frequencies.
I think so, yes.
And then the white is where we have the most vulnerability. And that's really where all of the 4G and 5G exists.
And we use this every day. It's
right. It is our daily uses in that.
You call somebody in another country. I mean, I grew up with the whole phone thing. You had the landlines and all that. And now it's incredible. It is the best tool. How do we use it as safely as possible and exploit it for all the technological miraculous things that we can do, and yet realizing we're playing with a hot tamale, we're playing with fire. And so, but I'm grateful for that every day. You place a call, it goes up to some satellite, boop, boop, boop,
Right.
and instantaneously we see this kind of stuff. So as this technology increases, this is where it is. One thing, another analogy I used, and I might have shared this with you before, and again, you have the list of what we kind of want to cover and that goes, but this is good old-fashioned microwave. And we know the concerns with microwaves and why people are trying to get them out of their houses and stuff. And when I would meet with young kids and love to get into some discussion about their brain and protecting, because as you know in your conversations, many people are like, it's all safe. It's fine for us. So why we have to worry about it? It's a great tool. Here it is, nothing to worry about. They do these studies, or we're these studies. So a microwave. And I ask, particularly I like the 8, 9, 10-year-old kiddos. And are you supposed to stick your head in a microwave? No. And they said, well, do you know what frequencies microwave emit? These things that we use? And 2.5 gigahertz right here.
Wow.
5G, so-called, and this is my opinion, I haven't seen it really validated, but of course, going through 9/11 and all, and security, they used to call it machines. I have not heard that term used in a long time. They call them scanners. So we change the terms, but so millimeter waves are 5G. They pass through us. That's how you get those pictures through the center. Instantaneous. And then you leave and go about your business. But find that all the time. We just don't see it because we don't have the device to detect it. So that's more than, and you look at where we are with gigahertz up into the hertz range eventually, and it's penetrating. So I would use that analogy. And for anybody who's physics trained and other incredible scientists that are out there, of which I'm not one of them, one of the big things that we learned in school, the difference between ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. And there's vague divider somewhere in here. What's used a lot today to try to defunct people who are giving this life-saving message of electromagnetic pollution is, well, non-ionizing is okay. Ionizing is not. Ionizing means it breaks carbon bonds. But because it doesn't break necessarily carbon bonds, doesn't mean it doesn't have effects. And technically, microwaves are non-ionizing. So I still wouldn't want to put my head or anything else, any living in a microwave, because it's not good. So I don't spend time, if people want to debate non-ionizing versus ionizing, or they say, well, they're just thermal effects. And yes, that's been studied. But if you have radiation exposure, yes, there's going to be thermal effects as well. But I'm kind of getting off on that. It's an important, getting back, electromagnetic spectrum, all the frequencies. Oh, one other thing, RFR, radio frequency radiation, or ELF, extremely low frequency electromagnetic radiation. You'll see that acronym used sometimes. That's generally like 300 hertz and below. It's a lot of the electricity, which is a whole other issue, the dirty electricity and the stuff of what we're affecting. It might be a lot less powerful and invasive, but I'm still not going to stick a metal object into the outlet on the wall, because that's going to not be good for me. And so that's the ELF, extremely low frequency. And then radio frequency tends to be much higher in the mega gigahertz. So that's my very simplistic way of classifying, and they both have issues. What we're talking about in the world we're living in is this is what's exponentially growing.
I've heard rumors that there's a 6G already being used in the military.
Oh yeah. And I'm perplexed I don't watch TV. I do try to keep up and do a lot of reading, but lately hurricane coming through here yesterday and the tropical storm. Of course, you go to the weather apps, and I always use the free ones because I'm too cheap. And you have to look at the little, before you watch some clip where they're going to tell you how horrible the storm is coming. That there was one of the cellular companies, and it talked about 10G, and you get a free phone with it. It's a 10G. What are they talking about? And I'm not sure where that's coming from, unless they're using the G for gigahertz instead of 5G, fifth generation, sixth generation, what's the G stand for. But again, there's good stuff that can be used to help. And a wonderful book that was written, and we may have talked about that before, that's now, I don't know how old. Actually, I may not have it here, but it was written. Sorry to do all this to you.
That's okay.
But it was called Counter Currents. And it's so important. It's such a good read. It was over 20 years ago, but it was called The Perils of Electronic or Electromagnetic Pollution and the Promise of Electromedicine. These things that we use and have as our tools can be very beneficial. I work with neurofeedback and things like that have been used for 67 years, which is a non-invasive way of exercising the brain, like going to the gym. Mm-hmm. It works on the principle of our electromagnetic, our brain networks, without introducing any current or chemical into the brain. But that book called Counter Currents is really good when he wrote it. And I have a quote by him, which, let me show you that one. It may engender some more discussion if I can.
Okay, I have a question for you though.
Yes, ma'am.
So going back to that slide where you were talking about the blood, you were talking about the brain, and you're talking about how it does get into our brain. So I feel like this is a good conversation to lean into, because Joe Rogan, it's like, yes, he just had this conversation with Kennedy Jr., and Kennedy Jr. was talking about EMFs and how we've been able to show that they pierce the blood-brain barrier. So can you talk into that a little bit more? Like, what does the blood-brain barrier mean? Yes. And how does that work?
So, and to leave us behind, this is the book, which I don't have any financial investments. It's an older book. It's an amazing, that book and The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, I think, are some of the most paradigm shifting books that people can read and look at the references and study. But Dr. Becker, 50 plus years ago, said, I have no doubt in my mind that at the present time, 70s, the greatest polluting element in the Earth's environment is the proliferation of electromagnetic fields.
Yeah, a lot has happened since then. Changes
a little bit. So let's jump ahead to and I'll probably use some slides here if I can.
I do feel like it's important, before you answer this question, I feel like it's important to re-emphasize what you're saying about 5G, that when we come out with like a new cell phone, every time we get a new cell phone, you think like there's a small percentage of like increase in how it works. Like maybe it has a better camera, maybe it has, a couple of new features to it, but essentially the same. That's not what this is. When a new variation of 4G, 5G, each cycle, it's not just like increasing by a couple of percent. It is literally going from like a small percentage to massive, huge difference. Like from 4G, 5G, like 4G was still in like the lower gigahertz, like higher megahertz, but then 5G is like high gigahertz, which is thousands of megahertz. You know what I mean? So I feel like that's an important thing to emphasize, that it isn't just like small increases. It's a huge difference every single time they come out with a new one of these. Yeah,
I would agree with that. And it's incredible. It's incredibly useful. It's faster.
Right.
Because we can't wait. I got to have it now. The microwave mentality, but I want it now kind of stuff. But it comes with a price. And we're not, unless you start looking, have a pretty traumatic event like you through, and you start looking through, wow, what could have caused this? And you may not ever get full answers, but when you realize what you can do, it's led you on a path to even more healthy. You were already looking at healthy nutrition and things back during your pregnancies. And That's incredible. So it's correct. I mean, it's just being aware. We have incredible tools in our lives, but if we're not aware of the side, how to use those tools correctly and safely, it's kind of a problem.
I think this is such an important conversation too, because not many people that I speak to who are mothers have ever even thought about EMFs. But I will say that a lot of mothers are thinking, like, especially right now, and the way, and I think that in a lot of ways, this last couple of years have been a huge blessing, because it's a lot of questions for people. People are thinking more for themselves. They're starting to question how things kind of went. And that's not to get political or to make any statements. It's just, that is how it kind of unfolded. People started kind of taking matters into their own hands a little bit more. And because of that, a lot of mothers that I encounter, people you wouldn't assume, you know, for many years, I had to just kind of keep my stuff to myself, because you are like that person. If you say anything about any of this kind of alternative way of doing things, then you become that person that's just like eye roll. But now I'm so surprised by how many mothers and just people in general that I can have these open dialogue conversations, and they're curious and they're willing to listen. So I think this is a really important conversation, because people are curious, but this isn't something that people know to look for, because it's out of sight, out of mind. It's this invisible thing. And it's not even like, you know, with like cell phone companies, they're not talking about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. They're talking about it being good because it's faster, but it's not even addressed on whether or not it's safe or not safe. It's just not talked about. Like that's not even a question that people think to have, because it's just this thing that makes your phone faster, you know? And so
Can you imagine if we had commercials like for the pharmaceutical companies when they advertise some new, you know, TV commercial, and the people are running through the field, and there's butterflies and flowers and all that. And then towards the end are either running along the ticker tape at the bottom or something. And also, if you have any symptoms, if your brain falls out, if your gut falls out, if you have tell your doctor. You know, it's like they have to put all that in there because the FDA requires that. But if we did that for cellular technology, but it's like it is really more than the invisible element. As you said, you can't see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or feel it. Most people, there are people that have more sensitivity in the frequency. So
okay, so let's go back to the brain barrier, and how are you seeing children's development? What is this looking like for you? Like over the years, have you seen an increase in things like depression in children, and where are you, like, what are the correlations for you? What are you looking at?
Two big questions.
Yeah, two big questions.
What's continued, I guess we didn't really finish because I was already down some rabbit hole on the whole career growth and expansion and learning more and more things. But in my experience, and I think eventually more and more data will be confirmed from the CDC, Center for Disease Control, but every hospital I go to and work at, the experience when I have conversations with colleagues in the ICU, in the emergency rooms, the hospitalists, not let alone in the clinical outpatient clinic setting, particularly in pediatrics, also an adult, but I'll speak to my world of pediatric neurology. Hospitals are fuller or overfull with children and adults, young adults who are sicker than ever, more complex than it was, and not just because we're dealing with better diagnosticians. Kids are sicker, and that's why burnout, at least one of the factors, is such a life-challenging, life-threatening issue around the world, to the point where ICD-9, the World Health Organization, includes burnout codes now, because burnout is huge in many professions, let alone healthcare. But the hospitals are busy, the ICUs are fuller, the ER, they're boarding people, they're complex, much more complex. And there has to be a reason for that. And it's not just because it's not explained just on population statistics or application, because we are sicker. And when I look at a simplistic, with all respect to Magda Havas, who I borrowed this from the Electromagnetic Frequency Conference, medical conference 2021, was a great conference. So I didn't do anything in any of these slides or anything I say. It's what I've learned and kind of synthesized in my own presentation. But this is not how it exists in science and real. But we show this to say, as you said, it's different from 1900 to 2020. My premise, and I do want to get to the blood-brain barrier because I think that's really, really important. My statement is we are created as electromagnetic beings living in an electromagnetic universe. That, and this was given to a specific audience of about 50 different clinicians from around the world, so it's a little bit different than our context. But as such, if we are also living in an increasingly electromagnetically polluted world, it's going to have an effect on our electromagnetic being. And it's going to be different because we're humans. Every single human is different. That's why you can't prescribe the exact same dose of some particular medication based on somebody's body weight. But that's kind of what we do because that's the only way we can manage such a volume. And then if we have time, we will get into some of this. But the other thing is our brain, being one of the most incredible electromagnetic organs, is easy to test with the EEG. And because it's electroencephalography measured in nanoseconds, we're seeing more and more changes in the EEGs that reflect, at least in part, electromagnetic pollution. And that's not new. And one of the discoveries, it's not a discovery, it was a discovery for me, it's been around, was when I serendipitously stumbled on the Ukrainian and Russian literature, extensive literature published after the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, 1987. And they did incredible effects on EEG, studies on EEG in both those who survived, called acute liquidators, as they called it, or the cleanup workers. And we know about the other similarly. It's crazy. But the evidence is out there that our brains are changing. And then, when you talk about symptoms, what does it look like? And so one of the things I'll be talking about in Montreal is that in my experience, that's where I was. Let's go back, rewind. So as we go back, hospitals are busier. I am seeing more children, for example, with seizures earlier at birth, seizures, developmental problems, genetic incredibly compared to when I first trained. And there was a few things we could find, like trisomy 21 or Fragile X. And now, unbelievable amounts of mutations that are detectable. So yes, we're better in that, but that doesn't explain the amount. And I think we all intuitively understand that if you're exposed to radiation, that can affect our DNA. I think that's kind of, people accept that from what we learned. But we think of that in terms of radiation, some nuclear reactor that's leaking near us or something like that. And we don't realize what we're talking about, RFR, radio frequency radiation, is part of that. And as we're exposed to that, particularly in the developing child, we're going to see more and more. So that's been, as I look at the data and keep working in different hospitals and try to click my heels and say, this is not real, it's not really happening this way. And in the meantime, there's so many kids, particularly, and I focus, of course, on kids with seizures. And but it's not just the brain. So I won't go in, obviously, to all 223 slides here, but I talked about, we do know with electromagnetic radiation, there are cellular mechanisms. Those have been pretty well described, not just by Dr. Paul, who's an incredible clinician researcher, but how this affects our electrochemical cells as well, and why that leads to often predictable symptoms, particularly inflammation. If you go out in the sun too long and you're radiated, what happens to your skin? It gets inflamed. We call it sunburn because the body's trying to protect what's happening. This is happening all the time and at every aspect of the cellular level. So I think that's one of the prime mechanisms of radio frequency electromagnetic radiation. And we are going to get to the blood-brain barrier because that's really important. So there's plenty of discussions about mechanisms, but what about these biological effects? And we go on, and here's what you mentioned, and we'll talk about that now, but they're all related. We know oxygen, reactive oxygen species, mitochondria, virtually every part of our body are affected. If you radiate something, it doesn't work like in the Marvel movies, where it turns into the incredible, wonderful giant or something. It has adverse effects. I haven't obviously watched enough Marvel movies. But, so these developmental anomalies, the problems that we're seeing in kids and aberrations, and I'm using the scientific terms, but they're increasing pre and postnatal. And what I don't have, and I don't know if we'll ever track it because people aren't asking those questions, how do we show that that's the case? And the standard thing, like when you talked about moms who are thinking about or getting pregnant, there's more discussion, but for the most part, we don't even think about that. That's why I love the Baby Safe Project website that we talked about before, as far as getting parents, new parents and grandparents aware of electromagnetic radiation in pregnancy and things like that. So the developmental, we know kids are susceptible to all kinds of things in the environment, all the toxins in the environment and trauma that kids endure. They're more, it doesn't mean the adults aren't susceptible, but the developing brain, which really goes on through our whole life, I think. But when you look at myelination and aspects of brain development, we're talking into the high 20s, 30s, where this is still, to me, a developing brain. And we know that's a uniquely vulnerable population to toxicants. And so, and I talk about EEG and this incredible stuff here, but when we get to, don't you love these slides? It's too many. And there's, what I had some critique from some wonderful colleagues on my presentation. I throw in too many articles, but I want to show them I'm not completely making this up. This is in seminal articles in Pediatrics, which is the worldwide pediatric journal, national journal. This was published in 2005 by Giefitz and colleagues. Guess what? We have a problem. And they called for, let's have attention, let's work on this. And there's been a lot of it, but how often is it become a prime discussion in pediatric visits? Well, baby visits. And when you go see your pediatrician for your kids, they probably say, well, make sure they don't smoke and make sure they eat well, and make sure they rest well and exercise, and don't be on screens too much.
Yeah, but it isn't about the EMF. It's more just about, don't technology that much, but
Right.
They don't really ever talk about. Yeah, I came across a couple of studies with children, and it was talking about how children have more vulnerable tissues. And I don't know if that's also correlated to what's going on in the brain, like your brain's more vulnerable, but
Both.
Okay. Yeah, because I feel like I feel like children is really, really where we need to focus our energy in the protection aspect. I mean, obviously everyone, but I feel like everything that I've read, it's like children are definitely the most vulnerable to exposure because they're still developing. And it makes sense, like what you're saying. I'm, you're talking a lot of science, so I'm trying to pull it.
I'm trying not to do too much of that.
No, it's good, but I'm I'm trying to put it in my own way of okay, this is, but for me, it makes sense, what you're saying about the body being this electrical. I haven't really ever thought about it that way, this electrical body where pretty much everything that our body does relies on these small communications via electricity to send, maybe to do something with the cells or to send something this way. It all on communication through electricity, right? Brain. So I think it makes sense to me that we like, just common sense for me is like, okay, well, of course our body would start having a hard time communicating what needs to happen when it's being bombarded with these freaks that are super chaotic. They're not consistent, so your body can't really adjust to it. And it's now contending with all of these basically communications that are coming in from the outside while also trying to still communicate with our own body. Like for me,
Exactly.
in that sense, just kind of makes sense why our body would start to struggle, lead to things like oxidative stress and lead to things like inflammation, because our body is literally not able to communicate properly to send signals where it needs to send signals to.
I think we're done. You summarize. I mean, that is it. And as I said, we are electromagnetic. The chemistry, the neurochemistry is secondary, not secondary in importance, but when I saw people make lifestyle changes, get neurofeedback and other things to get healthier or to exercise and eat better, everything functioned better electromagnetically, which is easy to test in the office with EEG and QEEG. And then the chemicals get better. If somebody is going to the gym because they've realized they have a high BMI or their cholesterol's out of whack or they've got all these cardiac problems, and as part of their whole management, the healthcare provider says you need to exercise and eat better. When they do that, the body, the way it's created, knows how to get better. It will start getting better. As that's the case, they will need the blood pressure or the cholesterol numbers or something like that will naturally start to decrease towards more neurotypical levels. And therefore, the medicines that are being used can decrease if they're getting healthier. We almost never approach the brain that way, but the brain's the same way, even more so it can improve. But when's the last time you had that discussion with somebody? Here's your brain medicine prescription, and we're going to do all these things to make your brain healthier in the meantime. And as that works, and we're going to be able to decrease this antidepressant or whatever, because you're going to be making changes that are affecting your whole system. So the chemistry, when the electromagnetics get improved, or they're not being continually worsened by the invisible stuff in the environment that we've been talking about. Because if we do all these changes and you're still sitting by your router or your phone's, or you're using Bluetooth, or your has by your bedside, or you've got boosters throughout the house, or your smart meters right outside your bedroom, all those things, then the trauma is going to continue to happen. And that's why this part is so important to be aware of.
So can you stop sharing this real quick so I can see your face?
Yep. And then hold your thought. But that when you said kids are more vulnerable, I mean, the brain, particularly when we're alive, is a wonderful, vulnerable organ. So as long as we're alive, there's still hope. But kids, and they emphasize this in this almost 20-year-old article, additional research, development, what they call the precautionary principle, which has been known for a long time. If there's a question that something might cause harm, don't.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for teenagers a lot, but there's a question that it might be causing a healthcare implication, let's do more safety studies. And that's what's not happening. So, yeah. And then we'll come back to because I have that, all these studies, why brain development is so crucial, that again, is kind of common sense. And then we'll come to all the neurotransmitters, which have shown in studies. This is a horrible slide because it's not meant to be read, but all the neurotransmitters, which can be affected by electromagnetic radiation. And those have been shown in studies. So it affects us electromagnetically, but it affects us neurochemically. And then we'll get to the brain barrier when you're ready. Okay.
So what is actually like you're talking about the children are being exposed, they're more susceptible. You're talking about treatment. What are you actually seeing? Like, what is the toxicity? Yes. What is the outcome of this toxicity? What are the symptoms that you're seeing from children that are leading you to be like, okay, I mean, obviously it's something that we know we need to address in general. And right. You just want your like foundation checklist, like, okay, but what are the symptoms? What are the things that you're seeing from all of this toxicity, including other environmental things as well?
I'm going to do it to you again. I'm so intrusive. Look at one simple thing. based on this, remember we talked about where there's neurons everywhere, and because we're electromagnetic beings in the gut, in their urogenital systems all over the place, that's affected. But your question, I think, is somebody's not going to show up in a healthcare provider's office and say, I'm having electromagnetic symptoms.
I'm having hypersensitivity. Yeah.
And if they do, they're going to get sent to a mental health provider because they will be immediately assumed, like with fibromyalgia in the past, that you're I don't want to, you need help that a real doctor can't provide, that kind of stuff. So when I look at symptoms, this is a nice simplistic, but these are some of the most common symptoms, and they don't come, headaches are huge. They absolutely increased in frequency across the age spectrum. And some of it is the very thing, we've got our blue light glasses on, cheap, easy to do. I always use the F.Lux, which I don't have any investment in. It's a great, it's the screen filter for the blue light. So that's an issue. But sleep, anxiety, depression, memory issues, which ties in with cognitive and attentional issues. So I think all of those are some of the most common symptoms. I don't really get into the skin problems, but it kind of makes sense what's been reported in the literature with cell function and things like that. So dizziness, there was some stuff in one of the listservs today about heart palpitations. And one of these clinicians was wondering why they're seeing more people complaining of heart palpitations. Well, is the heart, what do you do to test a heart? Not only an echocardiogram, an electrocardiogram. It's an electrical organ, and often it's vulnerable and susceptible, especially if we carry our electronic devices close to those organs. So getting to your fatigue, weakness, sleep is probably one of the biggest ones. And so that's why there's such an explosion of use of nutraceuticals and prescribed substances to help people get to sleep or stay asleep. And that can certainly help, but pharmacologically altered sleep is never going to be as restorative as natural sleep. But if our sleep environment is continually toxic with what we're sleeping in, we're sleeping in the radioactive fishbowl, we might get better perceived sleep from these medicines. But sleep is one, headaches of various types, memory, of course, visual issues.
Children?
Pardon?
You're seeing this stuff in children? Absolutely,
yes.
Oh.
Yeah. And of course, I don't have seizures on here, but it is definitely, as an epileptologist and a neurologist that specializes in that, I still think that's a big issue. And that is also what I'll be presenting next or in October at this thing called World Congress of Neurology. I'm not getting paid to do this. So it's none of that's there, but talking about the unrecognized, it doesn't show up real well, Michaela, but it's unrecognized adverse effects of environmental electromagnetic radiation on development, particularly neurodevelopment, of course, genetic health. I don't know in your community, but how often do we hear about couples who are having trouble conceiving? How many people are getting in vitro now? Much, much more. And of course, it's more available, but it's more than that. And this propensity toward early onset seizures and epilepsy. So again, kind of a big issue of what I'm seeing. And so those are symptoms. This is 50 years old. This list of symptoms, what used to be called radio wave sickness back in the 60s and 70s. The literature goes back into the 30s and 40s with what's called microwave sickness or wave radiation. And again, depending what symptoms, again, so much of the use is in where all of our electromagnetic organs are: pulmonary, cardiac, GI, GU, brain, all those kinds of things. So that's why you get a ridiculous list of symptoms for all kinds of people. Not everybody's.
I imagine that would be difficult for people to pinpoint, especially when they're just.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost like there was a really big this epidemic of like Lyme disease, and it was like one of those things I saw a lot of people go through where they were having a hard time even like diagnosing it with that because there was just so many wild symptoms and they couldn't pinpoint what it was. And so they were going through, but it's kind of similar to that. Like there's so many different symptoms that it would be difficult for someone to just, so it's like, I like the approach of like the precautionary approach, like get things in order. So let's go back there really quick. What are the basics?
Please.
What do you first go to whenever you have a sick child or whatever? And, what are your foundational things that you look at, that you get in order to kind of get them, and then you can start looking at the other stuff.
In clinical encounter, the first and foremost important thing is history, which of course in today's medical system, having to increase the pace of the hamster wheel, seeing people quicker and quicker and quicker. And so that's probably some of the reasons I did such a bad job in practice. You have to get a history. And that's the first most important thing, a good, thorough history, and ask the right questions. The second most important thing is getting a good history and asking the right questions. The third most important thing is getting a good history and asking the right questions. So you get that history, and then you do your examination, clinical exam, neurological examination, and using that body of information coupled with symptoms. And I just threw this one up because these are all symptoms of all kinds of stuff, but they're also prime symptoms of blue light overexposure sensitivity and electromagnetic. So when again you talk about symptoms, people aren't going to come to seeing their health provider. They're going to say, I've got some problems. I've been having some palpitations and I've got ringing in my ears. Go figure, ringing, that's so much more common right now. Where do we put our devices? So at least part of that. Concentration, and I've been a little bit dizzy and I have some balance and I have these funny stabbing pains, and it's like, and that's like overload for a clinician. And the more symptoms, the more we're likely to say, yeah, well, we'll do some lab tests and see if they're okay, and then have a nice day. It's just overwhelming, particularly because we don't know how it ties in. And this one, these are key symptoms of what's called screen syndrome with kids and adults. When there's oversensitivity and overuse, who isn't on a screen like we are, hours and hours a day? Tied in with that, with the social media and all the problems. And I mentioned it, I think last time we talked, since we have a second, but please have anybody you talk to go to the Surgeon General's website and pull up it was about 2 to 3 months ago, just released social media warning that the Surgeon General's office put out. It's only 20 pages, but he said we have a crisis throughout the world with mental health, anxiety, depression, and they concluded that they could not conclude, I love the language, that social media is sufficiently safe for children and adolescents. That's a big statement. So just like we learned smoking was the problem, we'll eliminate smoking from the world. Now we're going to eliminate social media from the world. Yeah, right. So
right.
I avoided.
People are way too used to it, way too addicted, all the things. You can't just strip it away now, but you can tell them the truth because they're already addicted. Yeah. Okay, so let's go back though to how you treat.
Yep.
What's the foundation? Where do you start? I know you mentioned to me you're like meds.
Yes, so prevention, which has been around for years, discussed centuries, I guess. Prevention is better than cure. And so first of all, and even doing that, there's still problems. You were living a very preventative lifestyle, healthy lifestyle, as you had your babies, and still problems happen. So it's not this, what I call prosperity gospel thing. You do this and your life is going to be good forever.
Oh, yeah, that's deep.
Life happens. Life happens, and life is not fair. So when I would see that, I would do a diagnostic workup, and many kids, we'd do an EEG, and then I do what's called functional or quantitative mapping, which is easy to do. It gives you the functional look at the brain, not functional MRI, which is really cool. It just costs millions of dollars to get it. But you can look at the dynamic functioning and look for areas in the networks of the brain that are overactive that correlate with symptoms. And so I bring those up and show those maps to people. They were called brain maps, and say, this is correlating with these symptoms. And people would, oh, because somebody told me it was just in my head. Ever been told that? And what I would tell them is, yes, it is in your head because it's your brain. It's not because when it's in your head, and at least in healthcare, it's telling people, it's like, go elsewhere. You're faking it, you're making it up, whatever. And especially when there's this potential plethora of symptoms that a clinician can't put together. So I would take that before I would prescribe or recommend medication. And usually I didn't do that first thing because most of the people coming to see me had already been there. And you referenced this a little bit earlier. People are often coming to ask questions about electromagnetic health as a last resort. They've never heard about it. They've been through the ringer. Something might have gotten better. Stuff continues to occur. And as a last resort, we'll go see another neurologist who isn't necessarily, if all I did was prescribe the 8th or 9th or 10th medicine, what difference does it make? Because there was a reason these other 7 or 8 didn't work in certain people. So getting back, what would I do? And that's where years ago I came up with that really complex acronym called MEDS, because I made up something that would never be copyrightable. Like, why would I want that? Moving, eating, disconnecting, sleeping. And I call those the fundamentals of health. And when we're less sedentary moving, and what I would tell kids is, thumb exercise doesn't count as cardiovascular, but moving, the brain gut connection, or the gut brain as it's called more often today, that the gut and how much what we put in influences us. The disconnect, the deep part, more than just screen, it's the whole world of EMF and screens in our environment. And then S is for sleep, and looking at our sleep sanctuary, which I took that term from the Building Biology Institute, and they have a great little one-page handout that's just, how do we make our place safe? Because people are spending time at home, more time in the home. COVID, we had a lot of problems before COVID, and we've got a lot more since. It also did an incredible thing. It's connecting us around the world more than ever before. As you said, some really neat things have come out of the COVID, the CCW, COVID changed world, as I called it. So I would look at that, and then most of the time I spent on the D, the disconnect part, and the S, which meant a lot of education, getting people to hear stuff without overwhelming, without taking a drink out of the fire hydrant and saying, this is what I think is contributing to this. And what happened in my practice is in spite of giving what I thought was pretty, not only scientific, but just kind of common sense stuff like you referred to, and you'd watch, I would see people's lives turn around, often without medication, often with less medication. Many times I would have a family when they would come back in a few months, and they bought in. I didn't sell them anything. They bought into the plan of this meds or health, and they would come back and they would see changes. They would do what they would never tell their prescribers. They would start decreasing certain medications because kids would start having side effects because they were getting healthier. Again, if you're getting healthier and your blood pressure is naturally coming down, you don't decrease the blood pressure medicine. You're going to have side effects at that exact same dose that you weren't having before, because the body doesn't need, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's what I would do. Yeah. History, the clinical eval, neurodiagnostics, and other things, because I want to see what else is contributing. And then we'd begin the education and training process, and of getting people to be aware. As you know, years ago, you weren't aware as you are now. Hopefully our awareness continues through our lifetime, right? And I wonder
and like the first step is awareness, but I still, as a mother, I still have times where I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just let him watch TV for that long. Let him, and it's just, it's like, I think a really important thing to say in this conversation is to like give yourself grace, and so much information. And there is, when you really start diving in and start asking questions about your surroundings, about your environmental toxins, about how this is all playing a role, it can feel like literally everything is wrong and you need to throw away everything in your home and you need to like burn it down and start again. Like it does feel like that sometimes.
It's overwhelming. Yeah.
When you have children and you want to do what's best for them, when you're finding out like, oh, maybe what I was doing isn't what was best for them, you have to have grace, take one thing at a time. And I think this is a good time to kind of like pull in and talk about what are solutions, especially like the foundation. You talked about your meds. What does that look like with disconnecting, with helping out with this like EMF exposure situation that we're in? Like, how do you approach that? Like, that's a really good foundational piece.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it too, it's overwhelming. And it, like, especially when people come to see me and I'm a multiply boarded, multiply licensed, yada, yada, yada physician. But people would come often hopeless because they've been through it. And my purpose was to overwhelm them more. But hope, health, and healing were the little acronym, or the three words that I associated with what I want to do as a healthcare provider. And to do that sometimes is overwhelming. And as a parent and a grandparent who's been through that too, that overwhelming, oh, well, I screwed it all up. It's over. In kind of mentality. And I want to restore. There's always hope. As long as we're alive, there's hope after that too. But as long as we're alive, there's still hope. And people get hopeless. And when we lose hope, that's when we're gone. We either check out mentally, physically, that's such a huge issue because people's hope is being destroyed. And so there needs to be something tangible to jump onto. And we want to make sure before we finish, we talk about the blood-brain barrier because that's still kind of a crucial mechanism.
Yeah.
But it was,
I think that really plays into, how we got connected, which we got connected through Aries Tech and through EMF and EMF protection. And I was so excited to talk to somebody who knew about the product from like the science point of view, because, as a mom, you're really just kind of following your intuition. You're you do as much research as you can. And like, I went with Aries because I had done all of the things. I was unplugging the Wi-Fi. I got the baby blankets, EMF protection, all of those stuff. And did the crystals. I did all of it. Cause it's better safe than sorry, in my opinion. So do whatever you can. There's not enough, really, especially when I first, a lot of research to like indicate what was working or what wasn't working. So when I found Aries and there was so much research, I didn't fully understand all of it, but I felt like because of their history and how they started with research, they didn't start with a consumer product. I thought that was a really important part of who they were. And just like how much research period stuff that they had, I was like, okay, this is definitely a better route. At least we know that there's science here. So I'm excited to talk to somebody who knows, who actually can read the science. But so tell me, okay, because I feel like this plays into the blood-brain barrier, because I feel like this is really where the major issue seems to be. I know you said it's like the whole body, but there's so much research about the blood-brain barrier. So tell me first, what is the blood-brain barrier?
Okay. And as you say that too, as far as Aries Tech, and I've always wanted to have conversations with people where I'm not a paid advertisement and they don't pay me. I do this because we connected mainly through that one link that they did with Nick Douglas on the QEG, which was pretty cool.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm grateful to do that because I never wanted to be a paid advertisement for a pharmaceutical company or a political endeavor. And so same thing with Aries Tech, and that, sure, there's other stuff out there, but as I stumbled into it and have mine, I won't pull it out of my shirt, but it's on, where I wear some of that. We call it protective, more like it's an interference. It's almost like white noise, as far as we can't pretty much live in a Faraday cage all our lives. So finishing up what you said, what do I do? And then we'll talk about the blood-brain barrier. There's the prevention, and prevention, being aware and starting diminishing exposure, distancing, had huge effects. It's slow because people have been exposed. When somebody realizes at age 50 they have lung cancer, I think I'm going to quit smoking. Got it. There's work to do. It's going to take years to heal, and that kind of stuff. So it's not. And some of the studies that have been published, like with cell phones, they did acute exposure. Well, they didn't get brain tumors, or something ridiculous like that. Like somebody smoked for a month and they didn't get lung cancer, so therefore smoking's okay. Like, wait. This is not science. So what was the question? Anyway.
What is the blood-brain barrier? Because I really want people to fully understand what that is and how that plays such a significant role in like EMF and in the symptoms that we experience, especially
Okay.
in
3 slides. We'll do it quickly.
Okay.
He said.
Love it.
And he talked. So the blood-brain barrier, BBB, is exactly what it describes. I mean, the tied in with that, we know there's blood supply throughout the body. It took us decades to come to the common sense conclusion that there's lymphatics in the central nervous system in the brain. That was never taught. It was like the lymphatics stopped here in medical school. And in the last years, they discovered lymphatics like, oh, wow, it's kind of, duh, of course it had to be there even if we didn't see it. So the blood is there, and the blood works incredible, but not everything that's in our blood systems is meant to get into the brain. We have this incredible, miraculous thing called the blood-brain barrier, and which is composed of cells that operate electromagnetically. It's not just structural barrier, that's part of it. It's not just the chemical barrier, that's part of it. And they work electromagnetically. So physical trauma, if somebody has a physical traumatic brain injury, that's going to alter the blood-brain barrier, and you get bleeding and you get swelling and all those kinds of things that happen. So when many toxicants, and this is taken from another paper that I thought really did a wonderful job, but not looking at electromagnetics, but what happens when you broach that barrier, a wall that is meant for protection. It's trying to let through some stuff, but not the good stuff, and not let the bad stuff through. And when the bad stuff gets through, it invades, and it affects the components of the nervous system, which are always incredible. Neurons, the absolutely important white matter, when we talk about gray matter and white matter in the nervous system, and it has effects that can be physical or chemical. Those are the basic things that toxins do. Electromagnetic radiation is, in a sense, physical, even though we can't see it in the form. It's electromagnetic. It's a physical process that has chemical alteration as well.
So the EMFs are piercing the blood-brain barrier. Are they affecting the way that, are they affecting us? I'm trying to phrase my question properly, but are the EMFs like affecting the way that our like neurons are communicating, or are they affecting like the cells specifically? Or is it kind of like, how does this work?
Yes, I think it's probably more diffuse in both. So there is direct, it's not just the blood-brain barrier, but it's affecting the cells and the networks as well. But as far as affecting the blood-brain barrier, when it's affected chemically or physically by the EMF, it affects the functioning. So it can't protect. If you keep bombarding a wall with radiation, over time, that wall is going to start to slowly break down.
So it's not just going through the barrier, it's also allowing other things in.
Right. And so that barrier part doesn't function as well. So things that shouldn't be getting through are now getting through, which further worsen the effects on the brain and the nervous system. Yes, just that.
I feel like this is important because I didn't really know this. So it's not just the EMF itself. It's not just the frequencies itself. It's that the frequencies are causing a break in the blood-brain barrier, which is then allowing other toxins in. So it is doing its own form of damage, but it's basically opening up a door to allow other toxins in.
Yeah, it's preventing the locking mechanism. It's breaking down the door. It's putting a hole in the door, or it's screwing up the locking mechanism, so it's easier to break in.
Okay.
And this is a bit of an older talk, but on the Environmental Health Trust is another website, which I think is extraordinary for resources, but you can find, and also Physicians for Safe Technology, which I'm privileged to get to interact with. I'm not part of them. I'm not part of their board or anything, but Physicians for Safe Technology is another wonderful, and look up blood-brain barrier. And there are a whole lot of
I've seen
published peer-reviewed articles And again, in the prevention standpoint, precautionary principle, when in doubt, do anything you can to remove it. Don't put it on your body. Don't put it on your brain. And now I get it. I mean, every place we go, when I see people with Bluetooth or AirPods or whatever the correct nonpartisan term is, it's like it's a radio transmitting, receiving device on the side of your head or both sides that's constantly doing that, not just when you're talking on the phone or something. So does that, and I so appreciate your clarification is really good.
I mean, in my own, non-scientific terms, it is making a lot more sense, because it's like, okay, it's not necessarily that the EMF is the toxin. It's almost like the army that's breaking down the walls, that's letting the toxins in. It can be, which can be, I guess, classified as a toxin in its own right. But I think that the most important takeaway is that this is like I get what you're saying now. You're like, okay, when we last talked, you were talking about how EMF is like the biggest elephant in the room. It really is. Our whole body is electricity. It is the core foundation of who we are. And like what is communicating with our entire system, letting us know like, oh, you need to get rid of these toxins. You need to, flush this. And if the frequencies are interfering with that communication and allowing doors to open that aren't supposed to be open, it's a lot bigger than just, oh, how is EMF? Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, how are these like Doritos going to affect my system? It's like, well, it's because it's going to cause inflammation, and it's going to then not allow you to fight off whatever you need to fight off. It's not just that in itself, it's a bad thing. It's that it's allowing for other infiltrations to cause harm on your body as well.
It's a cascade. It triggers more complex avalanche.
Right. And I think that, coming back to children, that it makes so much sense why they are so much more susceptible, because their brains are still learning how to communicate and learning how to function. And so if they're constantly being bombarded, and then also having to like constantly contend with these other toxins that are being allowed in, because your body's just contending with too many things.
It's trying to, and talking about burnout at the mental health level, but when the body's having to fight constantly in the fight or flight or the protect, not just the sympathetic overdrive, but all these cells are working overtime, that drains your bone marrow and your immune system. So then you're even more susceptible to infection, inflammation, and it literally is just a horrible, vicious cycle. And all we're seeing,
like body being a battery, it's like draining your battery. It's like literally taking up so much of the energy that your body requires to fight off other things. So that makes sense why there's so many different symptoms. Yeah. And there's not just a specific symptom that's being caused, because it's not so much that the EMF is causing the symptom, it's the EMF is opening the doors for these toxins to flow in and cause these symptoms. So it could be any kind of thing, that any kind of toxin that's flowing in. That's why the symptoms are so different.
And it's like if somebody, maybe it's a bad analogy, but somebody has an accident, motor vehicle accident, and we think, oh, it's an accident. So these are the symptoms of an accident. Well, what if they've got all this bodily trauma, somehow miraculously their head and neck were spared? And we go, well, they didn't have an accident, because you have to have a brain injury for an accident. I mean, it depends what was most vulnerable in that accident. And as you said, when it's everywhere, and when you talked about being drained, mitochondria are they're the powerhouse of the cells, the powerhouse of the body. They're everywhere in our body. And so they're energetic, incredible energetic beings, the powerhouse of our bodies. And those are being affected at the cellular and energetic levels as well by EMR and a whole lot of other things. And so that, to me, and I think of this very simplistically, it is one of the reasons there's so much more drain going on, and why we're seeing certain changes like lower and lower amplitude in people's EEGs.
Well, and just like overall lower energy. People have such lower energy levels, like capacity levels, brain capacity, like there's so much fog. Like I mean,
Yeah.
mothers talk about it all the time, and we just always say, oh, it's hormones. And I'm sure there's an aspect to that of pregnancy hormones and motherhood hormones, but it's just like the level of fog that people are experiencing right now. And then to then think about, like, a child doesn't know how to explain that. A child can't put that into words. So I can see it in my kid when he uses an iPad for long or whatever, if he has access to something like that. And or it's the same if he eats like red dye or like an artificial dye. If people think I'm crazy, like when I talk about it, people are like, really? It's that one thing. I'm like, it is a poison. I'm telling you, it literally, it makes them act like so insane. So
it's a toxicant.
words. They don't know how to explain that they're not feeling right. You know what I mean? They're not, like, something's not right. And you can, I always feel so, it's when the mom guilt kicks in, like, this is on me. Like, this is not, this tantrum he's throwing, this is not him. This is not, you know what I mean? Like, this is something that he put in his body, or an environmental thing, like being on the iPad for so many hours, that it causes this like disorientation, I guess I would say. Like, it definitely, that's how I describe it, a disorientation. It's like he doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know. And you only need to see that a few times to be like, nope, we're not doing this again.
And sometimes the best thing we need, even as older people like me, is go take a nap. You're getting foggy, you're getting irritable. I don't know how to say I'm brain foggy, but I know that I'm irritable and I'm cranky. I'm going to have short. Who turned your fuse on? It's like, so it's recognizing that. And yes, you are crazy in that sense, and in the most affectionate sense. Keep being that way. The people that have made history impact it throughout history usually weren't very well received. And when you talked about being courageous or brave and kind of doing these things outside the box in the healthcare field, there's a fine line between, I guess, courageous and insanity, but sometimes they look very much the same. But supposedly Dr. Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. But if we do the same things over and over from a positive way, we can expect different results. We'll get healthier. And so it just takes time, and you have to be aware.
Okay, so real quick.
This is a lot. Okay.
We need to wrap this up. I'm sure you have other things to do, but really quick, what do you like? Let's going back to Aries, because that's what I use with like Aries technology. That's what I use for my children. Anytime we have anything going on in the house, we all wear them. We have them on our keys in the car, because our car is like a giant. I mean, it's a new electric car.
They're electromagnetic hotbeds.
So what is your understanding of how it works? Because I would love to hear that from you.
My wife came up with a much better, when I first met Caitlin and the team and stuff, it's like, I want to meet with your I want to understand the mechanism. And I wish she was here, and I would bring her in and do that definition. It's more interference. We're not inside a shielding cage, like a Faraday cage, but my understanding is more of an interference, like white noise. When you're trying to cut down outside noise, it's still frequency based, to my understanding, and it does that, almost neutralizing the toxin or the electromagnetic interference. And again, yes, as a non-paid, no checks have been received from Aries Tech. I've got on my phone, I've got that, and we've got the one that it's on my keychain, the one you have around your neck. And of course, I always, it's not coming through, but you can sort of see it. Well, anyway, let me.
Just blocked your whole face out, but we know that I think I have the one too. So how did you find out about Aries, and like what made you decide? Because you obviously, nice. So you obviously have a really big background in EMF. So for me, it tells a lot to me that you use this product. But how, like, you come and like what made you decide that this was the product that you would use and maybe recommend to other people?
One of the things was always lacking when I talked about the meds model or the meds approach for prevention, awareness, distancing, that, but what about further prevention? And that was always something that was missing. And I've had the privilege of knowing Nick Douglas for quite a while, who has neurofield and does EEG and neurofeedback and TMS and things like that to help people get healthier. And somebody emailed me, one of our, and said, Nick had this video that he did for Aries Tech. And I had never delved into various technology devices. And as you know, go to Amazon or go wherever, and there's like, it's another fire hydrant.
Yeah.
So I have not researched every one and done all these scientific or whatever analysis studies. And so I kind of stumbled into it because it was gnawing at me that was sort of a missing part. But I was also trying to avoid being a promoter, which is why I don't want to be paid by somebody, because I that's just sort of a hangover as a physician, that there's this mindset that if you're paid by a pharmaceutical, you're brainwashed, pharmaceutical company or something like that.
I think that's good, especially as a physician. I think that builds a lot of trust to be able to say that, especially, to be able to say, I'm not paid by anyone to give you my, opinion.
And I have great colleagues that work for pharma and all that, and they do a great job. It's just, it wasn't what worked for me. So that's how I stumbled. And I always say coincidences are God's way of remaining anonymous, but just stumbled into the Aries Tech, saw Nick's video. I called Nick, and then I called Aries Tech and I said, who are you? How did you link with Nick? And let's talk about the brain, because this is what I do every day, this quantitative EEG and stuff. And it is a way. And again, that's looking more at acute exposure, sudden exposure based on what they were doing with the phones and devices and stuff. And it still doesn't address, I think there's long-term. You can see acute effects of radiation in all the radiation medicine studies, but then there's the long-term. If you know people who have had radiation for certain disorders, there's post-radiation side effects years, decades down the road that continues.
Yeah.
And even though we're in a different part of that spectrum, it's still the spectrum. I can't shake that we're doing the same thing as far as seeing. And so anything that I can try to do from a preventative standpoint, can I do a scientific test and get your little EMF meter and do that? It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. And it's not the same, I guess, scientific paradigm as things like smoking or avoiding other toxicants, especially in our world where it's only going to continue to increase despite the message that you and others like you are getting out. So anyway, that's how I stumbled into it.
It's a very nuanced thing, because it's not something that that can, sometimes it can feel a little bit out of your control, because you can control what you put in your mouth, you can control what you eat, but on some level, and most people can. And I think that this is such a big topic for people, and I think that this is why people try to just like avoid it, because you don't see it. So
it's big. I mean, my brain hurts. It's like,
drive by, like I have this place that I take my kids to sometimes, and there's this tower that is connected. I noticed it the other day doing all these videos for Aries, which is cool that we both called Aries. Like I came to Aries too. Like, hey, I've been using your product for a long time. Like I want to be part of this message. Like I really want to help people understand this on basic terms, basic language of like what's going on here. But I went to take my kids to this play place, and there is this, and it's also a daycare. We don't do the daycare, but people bring their kids there on a daily basis. And there's a tower like connected, and it's a big giant metal building. And there's a tower connected to right on the outside, on the back side. I was like, parents would never know to think about that. They would never know if something started happening with their kid to think about the tower on the back of their daycare that the kid is spending every day. And that really blows my mind, because it happens with schools too. I mean, thankfully there has been occasions where parents have come together and they've like stopped towers from going up or whatever,
Yeah. Parents for Safe Technology is another really good website that people can access. Parents for Safe Technology, and advocating. And when you advocate for that, just like when you're a crazy mom that brings up all that stuff with your healthcare provider who means well, but they've got 12.5 minutes to spend with you or with your child, and sometimes more. And then you want to go into all this stuff and it's outside their scope of understanding or research. It's like, oh, here comes Michaela. Okay. But you're
Well,
right. There's no awareness if it's behind the daycare and things like that. Or look at the towers.
And the lady is lovely. I'm sure she's never thought about it. And I'm like, maybe I should say something. I don't know what, you have that dialogue of like, should I say that? But yeah, last question.
That's what you said an hour ago. No, go ahead.
Yeah, right. Where do you feel this is going if we don't take more of an action towards like protection and, taking precautionary measures? Like, where do you feel like our, just in the sense of like our environmental toxins, and let's just say we keep going with the technology, which is a great thing in many ways. We both agree on that. Right. But if we don't bring awareness to the protect, like what do you see happening? Do you see this kind of like coming out like 10 years from now? But now it's too late because we've already completely.
I hope it comes out more and more. I'd seen in a lecture years ago, read somewhere, the time frame from a significant scientific discovery until it's accepted at the public domain is average of 17 years right now from a major discovery. And we're well beyond that. And so when you first said that, what do we see? Then I feel like a little bit like Eeyore, because we're already seeing it. We're not recognizing overburdened, one of the best yet most expensive healthcare systems in the world, or disease management systems in the world, only getting worse. More and more, the hospitals are overwhelmed, the clinics, the emergency rooms, and they're all going to come in with symptoms that are valid for medical care, and we will patch people up. We'll use medicines to help various symptom suppression that we can, and then send them back out, which I feel like, and I may have told you this analogy before, to me sometimes, I probably could get analyzed for this, but the hospitals are kind of like triage hospitals, sort of in the war front. And there's this big, how I envision it, this big wall. And on the other side is some enemy, some warfare, and they're shooting fire arrows over the wall continuously. And more recruits are coming in all the time, shooting in more and more arrows. The people on this side are the healthcare providers.
And they're doing the best.
Trying to put out more and more fires. Literally more and more fires all the time. And we put out a fire, you help somebody who just got struck or whatever, but there's an ever increasing army that's releasing more, and we have no idea what's on the other side of the wall. And so with your question, what it feels like is the burnout that's already a problem, and the sort of temporizing but sometimes futile treatments that we're doing will work less or work not at all. And so there's more healthcare visits needed because what you prescribed didn't work. So you try to get back into the healthcare prescriber whose next opening is 6 weeks away or 6 months away. It's just be empowered to, like you and others, research your own healthcare, which is tough to do, knowing how to discern on the internet when you're doing your computer search. So what I see is just in the beginning of the tsunami. The symptoms, I think, are predictable based on the biological mechanisms and the cellular mechanisms. And if that's not decreasing but increasing, it will be a bigger and bigger tsunami. And all the while, not recognizing what's causing the tsunami. So that's kind of a discouraging way to end our discussion.
Well, hopefully more and more people like you pop up out of everywhere. And
parents like you. That's what happens at the parents level, because I'll go and talk to the World Congress of Neurology and the International League Against Epilepsy, and one or two voices might, if it, fortunately people are kind, I don't usually get a rolling eye, but it's like, hey, that's really cool. Now let's go on and do these new surgical studies and these new pharmaceutical trials and so on and so forth. And it's happening like most things throughout history at the grassroots level. Every support organization that I'm aware of that's influenced in healthcare were started by parents who were in the trenches with their child with some particular disorder, and they started to connect throughout the world with other parents or caregivers in the same situation. That's where it's building, the so-called grassroots levels.
Yeah. And that's really what's going to have to happen with like the medical world is like, almost, it's got to be the parents being willing to be like, okay, maybe look at, like, it's like enough of it has to happen for them to be like, oh, I need to start looking in a different direction. And I feel like that is already happening in so many ways. I see what you're saying. And like, it's either going to go, like it's either going to be like people are getting prescribed things faster, more regularly, changing things, almost every, majority of children in schools will be on something, or everyone stops and says, okay, we need a new foundation to work from. This is obviously not working. We need to start looking at these very fundamental things like sleep and eating and disconnecting and all of these, and like start again. Because I mean, you do that in anything. If you have a project or you have something and it's just not working and you keep trying and it's just not working, you're like, I'm swiping this and I'm starting again. I think that's kind of where we're at. We're at this pivotal moment in history. I think we'll talk about this later in life and be like, wow, this was a really pivotal moment in history. Where
Can you believe we used to believe blah, blah, blah? Can you believe they thought smoking not only...
Every generation has that thing that they have to wake up to, that they'll later in life look back on. It's like a haircut you got when you were a teenager, you thought was the coolest haircut ever. And later in life, you're going to look back on it and be like, I looked ridiculous. Like I think we all live in a generation where we're learning something like that. It's like, a simple thing would be like in the 50s when we had, the stay-at-home housewife, that was the thing. And it was like a imagery and all of that. And then like now we kind of, the pendulum has swung, and now all these women and mothers feel the pressure to both work and provide and do all of these things. It's the same with health. Like I think every generation goes through something that we have to learn and look back, and we'll look back on it one day.
Yeah. You're writing that history. So thank you very much.
All right, Dr. Rusty, thank you so much. I really appreciate you for being here with me for 2 hours.
Thank you. It flew by. Thank you thank you for engaging in it.
Putting up with from
Pardon?
you. Do you have a website? Do you have a website?
Yes, it's not the greatest. After COVID and the practice, the geographic practice closed, but it's networkneurologyhealth.com.
Awesome.
Network Neurology Health, and trying to get it more exciting because it's not very exciting right now, and informative for people, and have links. It doesn't even have video links right now to get people to well, don't put usable links on your website, because that takes business away from your website. I'm not trying to get more business. That's not, I've told that to you and Caitlin and others. It's getting people empowered to find the resources to do the homework. When people are ready, they'll start looking at this stuff. And you have to reach some point of desperation, like with a son facing this kind of surgery, things like that, that says, wait, I need to look at something different, something additional. And that's usually what it takes. We don't often change without some degree of pain, and realizing doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, is not working. And now it's time to look. So that's the website. Hopefully in the months ahead, we'll try to make it a little more better and informative.
Thank you so much. And if you want to learn more about EMFs and protection, go to ariestech.com. Thank you to Aries Tech for setting this meeting up with us. It was really awesome. I learned so much. I'm going to go back and listen and take all the notes. So
Send me all your corrections. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.